How are we doing, everyone?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. I have a very good session with Natalie
Oh, you did?
today.
Nice. Good to hear.
So thank you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Cool. Yeah, maybe in like another 20 seconds, 30 seconds, we'll get started. See if anyone else is coming. Did anyone get down to Perugia this past weekend? Were you over there, Basia?
Um, I was,
Oh yeah. That's a
yeah,
fun time.
my first time. It was great.
Yeah, it's a very I've never actually been myself, but it sounds like a really cool time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful city. A bit overwhelming because there's like 5 sessions
Simultaneously.
at every point, and it's sort of a paradox of choice.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're just gonna go ahead and get started as it is a Thursday morning, and I'm sure we have plenty of things to get into today. But yeah, I'll just give a short introduction here. So this is another of our speaker sessions for the accelerator. Today we have with us Basia Cummings. She's a partner and editor at Tortoise, which is a membership media outlet based in London. I forget exactly how many years you guys have been around, but it's been a really exciting approach to membership models. And a couple of the newsrooms in the accelerator cohort here are building very similar approaches to particularly engaging with their audiences and building a business model around that and whatever diversification opportunities and format opportunities that presents. But for everyone out there, so she particularly works with Tortoise Studios. This is the audio division of Tortoise Media, where they make all sorts of very prominent podcasts. For example, Pig Iron. This was one that was really on IPI's radar because it focuses on the death of a war reporter in South Sudan. This was in fact produced by Basia, so she can say more about that, which I'm sure she will. And they have a number of other podcasts as well in their suite of um, options. So I will. She was going to talk to us obviously about the podcasting division there and a little bit about the membership model at Tortoise, but really feel free to chime in with questions at any time, and she'll leave some room at the end for a Q&A as well. So it's really great to have you here, Basia, and I'll leave the floor to you, and just let me know when you want me to switch sides, I suppose.
Great. Thanks so much, and very nice to meet you all. So yeah, as Ryan said, I'm a journalist by training. I started my career at The Guardian on the foreign desk, and then I worked at the UN briefly. Then I worked at HuffPost when it was still a thing, doing news. And then I sort of got more into investigations, and I joined Tortoise in 2019, which was the year that it launched. And at that time, Tortoise had been set up by a man called James Harding, who's a sort of well-known name here in the UK in terms of news. He'd been the editor of the Times newspaper, and he'd been the director of news at the BBC. And his sort of philosophy to set up this new media startup was to say that in 2016, journalism in the UK, but globally too, had really misunderstood the news. So we didn't predict the Brexit vote. The news media in this country thought that we would remain mostly. And similarly, the win in the US of Trump shocked a lot of journalists who I think maybe either wanted to believe or were just out of touch with how the people that they were reporting on were feeling. And so James's view was that the news is so quick and so good at keeping up with every single update and every new newsline that it's missing the bigger story. And so that there needed to be a sort of slower approach to the news that wouldn't be about breaking news, but would be about looking at the kind of bigger shifts that are happening behind the scenes. And so, thank you for the slides. Yes, so maybe let's stay on this slide for a moment. So Tortoise was born out of a kind of desire to, I suppose, fix something about the way that the news was being published and broadcast. And the way that it was set up and when I joined was that Slow News was sort of divided into three areas. We would be an open newsroom, so part of sort of taking the news slowly is being open to people who either are experts or who experience, the news in different ways, or who want to have a say on how the news should be covered. So we were launched as a membership organization. So not as a subscription. So not that you just pay a certain amount a month and you get access to content, but that as a member, there were certain obligations on you, that you had a seat at the table, we would say, and that you would have a role in shaping the coverage. And so that was sort of mainly through events and debates and other ways of kind of participating in our journalism. Initially, when we launched and when I was hired as an editor, we were working in long reads. So we were publishing investigations in text form. And after about a year and a half, we realized that actually, if you want to involve people in investigations, if you want them to stick with a story, if you want to sort of give texture to investigations that text maybe can't, audio was the way that we started thinking about doing that. And so we moved from a text first model to an audio first model. And I'll talk a bit more about how podcasts have been important in growing our reach. And we also do newsletters. So that's another way that we sort of feed our membership, which is by giving them bespoke newsletters on a whole range of subjects. Can I have the next slide, which has a video in it, which we could play, which just gives you a sense of the journey that we've been on in audio since we made that decision to, oh, maybe it's not there. Should be a YouTube embed. No, okay. Let's skip the video. If you just go to the next slide. So what that video would have told you is that since we made the shift to audio, where before we would have a few thousand readers of our website, and we had 60,000 members by 2022. So we had grown a big membership base, but where we really got reach was by our podcasts. So podcasts that were hosted on Apple and Spotify and all the other podcasting platforms. And I guess it's one of the things to say is that we were very aware at the time that there's a kind of true crime boom, and that, every newsroom is starting a podcast and there are so many compelling series out there. And we really had to think about what would make us different. What was our reason for going into podcasting, and how would that build and serve the existing audience we had, but also was true to our mission that we're a slow news organization and that we're open. And so when we were developing our ideas for what Tortoise podcasts should be and should sound like, we sort of settled on these three principles, which maybe only I still stick to, but I think they're important. And they help me, I think, frame how the team works. So one of the amazing things about podcasts is that you can be open in them. So they are, and always have been, I think, since their inception, a particularly intimate form of publishing, because you're in somebody's ears and you can document your process as much as the reporting and the story that you're working on. So you can show your working, which has an openness and a transparency to it, not just who we are as journalists, but our own prejudices or our own, the risks or biases that we face in our work. So that felt like true to being open. It couldn't only be the finished story that was the podcast, but also the process of reporting a story. We also committed to being a narrative first news organization, particularly in podcasts. That's not necessarily true of everything we do, but in podcasting, committing to the principles of narrative. So thinking about how do you hold people with a story. Investigations are sometimes about systems. They're about broad and sometimes quite abstract ideas, and narrative, I think, is a really brilliant forcing mechanism to make you think, how do we engage people here? Who are our characters? What are the moments? What are the key moments in this unfolding investigation? Where is the impact? Who do you care about? And so it forces you to think, I think, in a much more human and empathetic way about stories that may otherwise have been quite abstract and cold, particularly when you're trying to do systems reporting. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. And as I said, that sort of true crime boom has been incredibly successful. There are tons of brilliant podcast companies and production studios out there who are, doing murder stories and cold cases. And of course, after we had a couple of successes, that we could feel the pull towards that sort of center of gravity, which is incredibly successful, which is, we were getting pitches from people saying, hey, there's this cold case that I'd love to reinvestigate. And none of that felt quite right to us, because we are at our core a newsroom. We're not a podcast production company. We're not an entertainment business. We are a newsroom. And so we keep the public interest at the heart of what we do. And so stories that we take on, whether they're historical or present, have to tell us something about now. They have to help us understand something about the way that we live, or about politics or geopolitics. And so just at the bottom of that slide, you can see some of the examples of the things that we've made. So Slow News is our weekly investigative podcast, which I host, which is a different investigation every week reported from our newsroom. Mostly we try and keep it a real spread of stories. Sometimes they're UK political stories. Recently, we've worked on investigations into the Rwanda asylum deal, which is something that the British government is trying to get through. Next week, we're launching a sort of mini series within the Slow Newscast, which is about Iranian hit squads, which are operating in London. And as an example of the kind of humanizing a system suite of reporting, Hidden Homicides is a 4-part series that we produced in 2021, which is about the UK police's inability and lack of curiosity to properly protect women who are in domestically abusive situations. So we were trying to understand how the data is really poorly captured, and how patchy it is across the country, and how women are therefore falling between the cracks where they may be in dangerous situations. And one of the stories that we focused on in that case was a woman who died at home. Her partner said it had been an accident. The police believed him, and that's because they didn't link up bits of data that would have told them that actually his previous partner had also died suddenly in the home. And when they realized the connection, they reinvestigated both cases and realized that both women had been murdered. And we found that happening not just in that one case, but in other cases around the country. We also have The Sense Maker, which is a daily podcast, which is 6 to 8 minutes every day, which takes one story in a narrative format to make sense of the world. So we try and sort of, rather than doing a news bulletin or kind of trying to do an assemblage of the day's headlines, we just stick to one story. We tell it through a character or a moment or a question. And we've partnered with Spotify's Daily Drive, which is a really big playlist that they have. So we're able to sort of access that big audience. So The Sense Maker is the most popular podcast that we publish. I don't know, Ryan, if you click on that audio, will it play? Or have all the links been taken out of this?
The last issue was that it didn't have I didn't have permission. I think I asked. I had sent permission.
Let me just double check. Maybe I can.
Let me see with the next slide. It's the bottom.
No, I don't.
I have it here.
Okay.
Yes. This is the audio.
Can anyone hear that?
Can you guys hear it?
We cannot hear it.
Okay, interesting. I'm listening to it on my end.
Let's give up on the audio. We can just go to the next.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry about
that. So I just wanted to give you a sense of, for a startup, we're only 3 and a bit years old, what this shift to audio has done for our reach and for our membership. So we've grown 88% year on year. Remarkably, for investigative journalism and for most newsrooms, our audience skews female. And it's a firmly millennial audience, which compared to most UK newsrooms is very unusual. Most people who pay for news and who consume the news skew older. And so what we found is that audio is a way to build a younger cohort, a different cohort of news consumers. And if you look at the listen through rate, 88%, that means 88% of our listeners stick through to the end, which if you compare that to the amount of time, when I was at The Guardian, we would be happy if people were spending seconds on news stories. And these are podcasts that mostly last between 35 and 45 minutes. So we feel that committing to audio, committing to narrative, committing to being open has enabled us to retain an audience that otherwise we might not have been able to access. And it makes them feel differently about the news. So some of the quotes I've included there these are from some of our Apple reviews, gives you a sense that different approach to the news, the slowness, the more sort of trying to capture the bigger story rather than just chasing what's happening day to day, leaves people feeling differently about how they engage with the news, which I think is really important, and is true to the sort of principles that we were set up with. If you could go to the next slide, Ryan. So again, this is The Sense Maker, our other sort of regular show. As I said, it features in the Spotify Drive. Again, it skews much younger. And again, the gender splits on that are pretty good for a news show. So next I'll talk about our investigations. So the thing that Tortoise has become known for, partly because we had a big hit a year and a half ago in a podcast called Sweet Bobby, is our sort of limited narrative series. So Ryan mentioned Pig Iron, which is one I did last year. Hidden Homicides, I mentioned, is about domestic abuse. London Grad is an investigation by Paul Caruana Galizia, who some of you might be familiar with. He was looking at the flows of Russian money into British politics, particularly looking at these a father and son called the Lebedevs. We've also investigated crypto and real money, and we've looked at a gender clinic, which is part of the NHS, which has become incredibly controversial over the use of puberty blockers. And so we've tried to I hope what sort of links those stories is, well, Sweet Bobby is a very specific story about catfishing and a sort of remarkable hoax that happened over 10 years, and Alexei Mostras's next series was Hoaxed, which sort of took some of those ideas about the bleed through of online into the real world and went with it again in the second series that came out last year. But these are investigations that sort of take one particular example to tell a much bigger story. And we've seen real success with these series as when we launch them on their own. And one thing about particularly if it's of interest in terms of building audiences, Sweet Bobby was such a success. We've had nearly 11 million downloads of that now. And we're able to because that audience have all subscribed, we're able to put what we call feed drops to our other series or our other shows in that feed. So we're able to move our audience, although it's off platform. So these are audiences that are on Apple or Spotify or other podcast apps. We're able to move them around to our other work and create a kind of coherence. So off platform, we are a channel, and we make sure that we have the sort of tortoise ident at the beginning of every podcast, so people start to hear that they're in the tortoise world, which I think is really important for sort of making people understand that what they're about to hear is what they should come to expect from our newsroom, which is slow, investigative, ambitious, beautifully produced journalism. And then next slide. I can't remember actually if there is a next slide. How much time have I got? I'll just quickly go through this because this is more about the sort of craft of the podcasts. And to give you an example from Pig Iron, which is a podcast I made myself. Usually I'm executive producing other people's work, but last year I worked on my own story, and I just wanted to sort of crystallize maybe for you why we think that this sort of narrative, investigative audio approach works for us. Partly, I think, is because you get to know the journalist, so you build, I think, not just trust, but a sense of access and a sense of openness around who is in your newsroom. So, you know, people get to know Paul through his series, or Alexi, or me, or other people who have worked with us. So it creates a sense of openness. One of the kind of key ingredients for our series is that there's a promise. The promise is not just what the story will be, but the promise is that we will answer a question that is of the public interest. So you know that you're coming into this, you're going to be taken on a journey, but that there is a destination that we're taking you to that journalistically is important. And the way that we sort of talk about that internally, and my colleagues are probably sick of us all talking about this, particularly myself and Kerry, who run the team, is that we talk about this washing line. So you need to have, if you imagine a washing line, so a piece of string hanging between two posts that you would hang your washing on, that single string needs to be the narrative. It has to be either one unfolding story, one question, one mystery that you will keep, or it could be the process. You know, it needs to be a sort of unfolding singular thread of narrative. But if it's strong enough on that narrative, you can hang other things of importance. So you can hang bigger questions, for example, in Pig Iron, the ethics of war reporting, or the situation in South Sudan, or the repression of journalists in South Sudan, or the privilege of being a white reporter in a country where, you know, justice doesn't come for the Black reporters who are killed and exiled. So if you have a strong central narrative, you're able to hang all of these other concerns along it. If you only have a bundle of concerns, then it becomes a thematic story, which I think is less compelling, much harder to construct, and much harder to keep people listening. And in terms of the construction of a narrative series, I've started to say to a lot of our journalists that we need to think in terms of streams, not blocks. So it's tempting sometimes when you're working on a big story to have blocks of story. So in this section, we're going to deal with this, and then we're going to deal with this, and then we're going to deal with that. And I think that narratively is really clunky. It gives people a lot of moments that they can check out. Whereas if you're running streams of ideas or streams of storytelling, sometimes overlapping, sometimes weaving in and out of each other, it's much harder to do, but I think it's a more sophisticated way of allowing journalism to unfold. And so we think a lot about how much do we script versus how much do we record in situ. So and sometimes we do things that are much more script heavy because we don't have on the record sources, or we don't have voices who can help us understand the story. But where we've got good access, sometimes it makes sense to let the story unfold in the moment and be much more sort of, I guess, give it a sort of texture that feels of the moment in the present, rather than I'm telling you a story and you're going to sit and listen to a host for minutes at a time. And then finally, I suppose the story, what I mean by the DNA is like, it's really basic, but, you know, what are the scenes? What is the beginning, the middle, and the end? Who do you care about? So just the kind of key principles of good storytelling. I think applying that to investigative journalism is a very powerful tool. And I think the success that we've seen from some of our series comes from that sort of commitment to treating them like stories. What's the next slide? And this is just the impact of that. So Sweet Bobby was the sort of first series that we really applied all of these principles to in a slightly more organized and sophisticated way, because we are a startup and therefore we are mostly in chaos mode. But this was a remarkable, surprising hit for us. It was 6 parts. We've now had 11 million listens. This slide is slightly old. We were the #1 in many different podcast charts. In terms of our membership, we were able to bring 4,000 new members because of a windowing strategy that we use. So to get the next episode early, you would have to subscribe. And so therefore, people who were totally hooked on the story paid to get access, and we were able to retain quite a few of those members. And then we sold the rights to a streaming platform, which also for revenue was important for us because it helped us recoup some of our costs. So between advertising in the off-platform podcasts, new members who are paying, and the rights, we could see a revenue model there that works for us. Next slide. Yeah, this sort of says much the same, which is just growth. So audio has enabled us to grow. We've won awards. We've driven our membership up, and we've driven our reach. We now get over 100. I can't remember now exactly the figures. Sorry, I should have checked before I came. But we're our listeners every week is very high now. We're at nearly 180,000, I think. Which compared to the website visits we were getting before we launched podcasts is an astronomical increase. I think that's everything. Yes.
Looks like it. Wow, fascinating presentation, Basia. I think everyone is probably captivated by this and wondering how they might or might not be able to replicate this themselves. It's really impressive what you guys have been able to achieve, and the suite or range of audio options. So no, really cool. I'm gonna maybe just ask a couple of questions to get the Q&A bit started, and then open it up to the rest of the group. So I'll start with just one. How has this major push, let's say even pivot into audio, changed the DNA of your business model? I mean, you mentioned obviously Spotify Studio, or Spotify as a streaming partner. You have your advertising and your off-platform services. But if I recall, in 2019, when Tortoise was really getting started, there was a lot of effort in retaining a certain member-focused identity that wasn't maybe as outward facing and more about hosting and engaging in conversations and discussions sort of that were with the community directly. And I wonder how and if that's sort of changed the DNA or idea of what like Tortoise is and will become.
I'd say it hasn't changed our DNA in terms of who we are, because I think those principles of being open and being slow have stayed the same. Actually, if anything, I think they've probably solidified because we see success with this approach. I think what it has changed is the sort of mix of how we see people coming to our newsroom. So you're right that when we launched, we were really sort of staunchly a membership organization, and I think the ambition of my two bosses at the time, James and Katie, who set up Tortoise, was that membership would be the main driver of revenue, or one of the main drivers of revenue. Despite enormous membership growth, that didn't become true, or it became true to an extent. But other forms of revenue were equally important. For example, B2B business, so where we work with, for example, brands on their newsletters or on events where people kind of buy Tortoise's services for their business. We also host forums, which are sort of business-focused forums around things like sustainable energy or food or AI. So where we have sort of in-house expertise, we also sort of make that available to brands, which is brings in a lot of revenue. But I think what we learned is that, I guess, if the calculation for us is things either need to have reach or they need to bring in revenue. So they either need to let as many people know what Tortoise is as possible. For example, Sweet Bobby. Sweet Bobby was a slight outlier because it did both, really. It brought in new members, it brought us ad revenue, but it also gave us reach. I think with most of our investigative series, they're expensive to make, and often they don't make a huge amount of money, but that is so core to who we are and our DNA, that we will always do them, but that's where other parts of the business will subsidize. So I think the key really is the diversity. And I think where perhaps we had all our eggs in the membership basket, we still have members, we still care about them, they still are a part of our newsroom, but we also have a huge off-platform audience, which we're hoping that through continuing to serve them will bring them closer to the rest of our journalism, and over time they may also become members.
Yeah, that's a fascinating development. And I think it was in the UK at the time when it was launching, so I was constantly listening and hearing about the membership launching, and it was so much about that engagement. But it's really interesting to see how you guys have diversified, and I think that lesson holds for just about everyone here who are either kind of building products from the start as they're founding, but also really thinking about that diversification opportunity and leveraging obviously their skill sets, corporate publishing divisions that can go out and do content studios, like you said. B2B business is a great opportunity to offset some of the editorial costs, which can be very high, to do the important work.
Actually, just to add to that, because we are a startup, we have to iterate. We can't, the version that launched in 2019 of what Tortoise is so different to who we are now. I think if we had sort of stayed the same over the last 3.5 years, something would have been wrong. I think the beauty of being a startup is that you can stretch and change shape and figure out, sometimes things have worked, sometimes they really haven't. And where they haven't, we've stopped doing things. And where they have, we've lent into them. And I think audio was one of those things that we started truly as an experiment. I mean, the first podcast we ever made was me and my colleague Kerry sitting in a cupboard. And that was the origins of all of this. So it was really an experiment. There wasn't a huge amount of strategy behind it at the time, but it worked out.
Yeah, it's inspiring somehow, and I think everyone's kind of thinking about those products that they're really trying to experiment with right now. One more, or maybe two more questions before I hand it over. I know you have a hand up, Chloe. We'll get over to you in a second. How does, you mentioned obviously the how this is expands your business model to off platform revenue opportunities. What is how do you what's the technology behind the setup of your podcast? I imagine, ideally one has their sort of own audio streaming technology that's, very expensive to build. This is why we all use YouTube as opposed to our own video services. How do you reconcile that, basic sort of questions around data collection, how you manage those users, funnel them into your, traditional business model, and how does that kind of fit in together? Yeah.
It's a really good question, and it's probably one of the messier parts of how we work, because so just to sort of explain the mechanics of it, we have our own website, which we have access to the CMS. We also have an app. The app was built for text. And actually the key thing to say is that in June, we are relaunching our app to be a podcast player. So it will be an audio only app, which we will obviously own and have and sort of own the CMS to it, which which is, I guess, in some ways a real bet that people will come and listen on our platform. There are so many podcast players out there. Most people use Apple. But I think our thinking about it is that precisely because we're so distributed at the moment, people can listen in Apple and Spotify and Acast and all these other platforms. Our data capture is quite patchy. We don't always capture all the information that we want to, both in terms of analytics and in terms of being able to email people and say, do you want to listen to this or that? So we're hoping that even if it's on a smaller scale, our own app will help us to understand our audience better. And it gives them a proper audio offering, which is if you pay a certain amount a month, can't remember exactly what it is, I think it's $4.99, you will have access to our whole archive, plus other things, and you have this beautiful app, and it is beautiful to use. In terms of the mechanics of how we distribute our podcast, we have a partnership with Acast, which is a podcast distributor, but also they are a commercial entity as well. So they sell advertising against podcasts. So that's one of our revenue drivers, is that particularly so advertisers like things that are predictable and regular and non-controversial, which makes news always a bit of a tricky proposition. But for our regular shows, so our daily and our weekly shows, we do have sponsorship and advertising in particular slots throughout the podcast, and that's through Acast. But, because podcasting is in general quite new, it is still quite messy in terms of the back end. So Apple, have a huge amount of power, because if they promote something at the top of the Apple podcast app, you really feel the difference in listens. And so, they are a kind of shop front for us, and having good relationships with those platforms is really important. But we're excited about the app because we feel that, we know we're not going to get millions of people listening to Tortoise on our own app. But if we can get thousands who are in our world and enjoying the curation, enjoying the way the things that we're surfacing from the archive, or making them understand differently about, the present moment, whatever's happening in the news, I think that will feel like an added value that we can bring and makes us feel different.
Yeah, I have a 1,001 follow-up questions on the technology behind this, but I will leave it to the rest of the group for now. Chloe, do you feel free to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Basia. It was super interesting. And I do have also 1,000 questions about everything you told about your podcast. We are also launching a podcast next week. So all that you said is super useful for us, and I've noted a lot of stuff that you said. I just wanted to ask you a few questions about, you said that you launched a new app for people to listen to your podcast on that app, but they will also have the option of listen to the podcast in other platforms as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and so on. So how are you going to monetize it on each? Is it do you have a membership in all of the platforms where people can listen to the podcast, or are you trying to drive people to one of the platforms so you can monetize it there? And so I would like to understand a bit the strategy, and also what kinds of KPIs and metrics are important for you when you're trying to understand if the podcast is working or not. Thank you.
It's a good question on strategy. I mean, so we have two forms of membership. So there's a membership which is access to everything that Tortoise does, which is newsletters, events. We have a book that we publish 4 times a year of essays. There's lots of other things that Tortoise is beyond audio. Audio happens to be, I suppose, the biggest reach, but being a member of Tortoise is being a member of much more than just audio. But we're also carving out an audio only membership, and that gives you access to the app. And if you buy, but we also have a Tortoise Plus in Apple. So Apple, their big strategy is to create subscriptions. So you'll see that they're really pushing channels. So we created a chance in Apple for people to pay to be subscribers of the sort of extra content. And the sort of motivation there is that you would get things earlier than just non-paying people. So, for example, if we launch a series and you really want to hear the next episode, or you really want to hear the behind the scenes interviews, or you really want to, see some of the source materials, that's the incentive to become either a subscriber in Apple or to get the app. The thing about the app is that it will have more capability than just getting things sooner. So we'll have it's not finished yet, I should say, and it's not launching until June. So it's still very much a work in progress, but we're hoping that it will feel like a much more total experience of the journalism that goes into a podcast. So there you'll be able to get transcripts, you'll be able to get sometimes source materials, maps, photographs that relate to the story, and extra features. So the strategy there is, if you pay, you get more, you get things sooner. And obviously when you pay, you don't get ads as well. Sorry, and then the second question, KPIs. I mean, it's not all podcasts do the same thing. So some of our podcasts are about reach. So the Daily Sense Maker brings us lots of people every day in terms of downloads. But that's not necessarily our audience. That's Spotify's audience. There is a wave of people who listen to that podcast, to that drive, sorry. It's like a sort of daily commuting drive. So that's not audience who necessarily are committed to Tortoise, who know who we are, but we are in the right place. And so we pick up that traffic, which is valuable to us in terms of reach. But it's not a retained audience, in the sense that if that drive, or if Spotify overnight were to decide we're done, we're closing this drive, or we're done with Tortoise, we had no control over that. So it's an important metric for us, but it's not a controllable metric. That's why I think listen through rate is really important. So we really take notice if our listen through rates start to drop, because we know that something isn't quite working in our storytelling. If people are dropping off a third of the way into a 40-minute podcast, or half of the way in, you can tell that something wasn't quite right with the story or the storytelling. And it's the same for series. I mean, it's rare that somebody listens to an entire series exactly as you release them. It's a much slower burn kind of audience. People might go and come back, or they might listen to it in their own time. But I think if you can see a really significant drop off, that very few people are listening to the final episodes, but loads listen to the first, I think you also then have a question about whether you quite constructed it right. Was the story strong enough to sustain that many episodes? And then it's a slightly more ethereal one, but like the reviews, the feedback, I think it's important to read them and to understand what people are saying, to understand whether you've quite got your audience right. Did you quite pitch it? If you think that you're trying to access a news listener who wants to, consume daily news bulletins, if all your reviews are saying this feels old, or this didn't, then that you've maybe slightly misunderstood who's listening. So I would say reach. There are levers you can pull that will get you reach, but whether that reach is retained, a loyal, they know who's making it and they're listening to it because it's a Tortoise podcast, I think that's important. And then listen through. Yeah.
Thank you.
I always enjoy a good fight against the platform. So I'm really excited to hear you guys kind of pushing into your own ownership of that data. Super important for the long term, especially no matter the risk involved. Anyone else have any questions? Sophie, I know you've got something brewing over there. Nothing? No? Sahi, you guys have been working on some radio products. Any questions from your side? All right, I guess not. Maybe in this case, I would round off with a final question from my end. I mean, a lot of the teams in this group are, some of them are more established than others. I mean, Hromadske Radio in Ukraine is obviously been around for a bit of time now. We have a Slovenian publisher that's been around for maybe 70 years. But most of the teams are within, a couple years of their kind of startup phase. everyone wants to diversify into new products. There's a lot of shiny items out there for reaching new audiences. What would your advice be to a company that, is strapped for resources, has a really, passionate, smart product, but is, exploring the different options of how to best convey their news, information, etc. And obviously podcasting will certainly come across their table. What would your advice be to a newsroom at that stage, kind of really thinking through whether or not this investment is worth it long term?
That's a really good question. I would say, I guess I would answer that in two parts. I think if you're really clear about who you are and what's different about your media organization, if you're really clear and you think people will understand what your offer is, what makes you different, why they should listen or read your work, then I think there is value in going to where audiences are. So building an audience is expensive. Unless you have a kind of amazing organic community or really famous journalists who are leveraging their own profiles, building an audience from scratch is difficult. It's really difficult. And lots of newsrooms, new newsrooms have tried and failed, not just in the building of an audience, but also in finding a way to make that sustainable in terms of revenue. And so I think one of the calculations that we made is that we are, I guess, trying to have our cake and eat it, which is that we're both trying to build an audience of people who are coming to Tortoise because we're Tortoise, but we're also accessing audiences who are consuming formats that we felt able to participate in and offer something different in the form of podcasting. So I think that's really key. If you feel that you have a product or an idea or a sense of identity as a news brand that can exist off platform, can exist somewhere else where the audiences are, I think that's a really smart move and can sometimes mean that you're nimble, you're focusing your resources somewhere where you might be able to sort of supercharge reach quickly in a way that you mightn't if you were just focusing on your own website or your own app or your own newsletters. Where, if you're not building, if it's hard to build organic reach, you might be spending quite a lot anyway on marketing, on trying to get people, I've lost my screen, trying to get people to see what you're doing. So where you might be spending, you could possibly save by going to where the audiences are. But then that brings other complexities like what we've talked about, which is that you have a big off-platform audience you don't necessarily have access to or own the platforms or the data, and so there becomes a bit of a puzzle then to sort of link up the bits that you own and you are with the audiences that you've accessed elsewhere. But I have to say, one of the great joys of working at Tortoise, having come from kind of big established newsrooms, is that journalism is inherently a volatile industry. Journalists lose their jobs all the time in redundancies and cutbacks. There isn't enormous stability in this industry anyway. So the idea that you can experiment and you can try and do things that feel interesting and creative and intuitive, and just see what works, I think is exciting, and it's no more risky to do that than to work in some established newsroom that might be making cuts in a second anyway. So I think there's great opportunity to try and do things differently, because otherwise, what are we doing?
Indeed.
Final thought.
Thank you for that. Yeah, daunting, but I think it's the kind of energy that I think everyone here is bringing to the table. There's a lot of creativity in the project people are delivering right now, if in no other way than the types of content they're producing and for a very unique audience. I mean, Lazy Women, for example, Sophia's project is really focusing on, a product for women, but, around the world. And you suddenly have this massive audience, across the planet, focusing primarily on Europe, of course. And how do you really start with that? And but they're big questions there. Any final questions from the field?
Yes, if I can have a question to Basia. Thank you for very interesting information. But could you please say more about using social media to communicate with your audience? Could you say something about that? Do you use it?
Yeah, we use social media. We're on all the kind of main platforms. I would say that social media is really good at how to put this? Social media is really important at brand building. It's really important for consistency, but we've found that social media is not the thing that drives people to content necessarily. So click-through rates are always much smaller than you think they're going to be. It's very rare that somebody sees a podcast on Twitter or on Facebook and goes, oh, I'm going to listen to that now. So really focusing, social media has a very important role in, I think, awareness and building community, but it's not necessarily a traffic driver in the way that I think it used to be. And so I think getting your tone right, getting, the voice right, making sure that you're doing your social media in a rhythm, in a way that feels authentic to what you're building is really important. But I don't think it's not the kind of magic bullet for organic growth that I think it maybe used to be. And where we sort of learned that the hard way, and that we thought, oh, we're going to put loads of effort into making little videos for social, and we still do that, but we've also then, where we've been able to, we don't currently have the budget, but we used to, where we would do advertising within other podcasts, because we found that that's really, when you're in already the podcast world and you hear adverts for other podcasts that seem interesting, you're much more likely to go and find them, rather than if you're in a different kind of context entirely. I think that's maybe slightly different for more traditional news. I think people probably scroll social media, and if they see an interesting news story, they're maybe more likely to click on it if it's short and easy to digest. But for us, we've it serves a different purpose for us, I think.
I have a follow-up on that point when you mentioned advertising within podcasts. I mean, this, I've been told on multiple occasions, is the most effective way to really get your podcasts a wider reach. Is that just exorbitantly expensive, especially to get on those podcasts that do have a wide audience, a frequent audience, how do you think about that strategy when you're delivering your own kind of sales strategy?
So it can be exorbitantly expensive if you're advertising in the biggest shows, but what we have done is we've done ad swaps with other sort of like-minded shows. So with people who we think their audience is similar to ours and ours is similar to theirs, you sometimes just will swap ads. If you want to do a kind of host read ad, so you want somebody to kind of endorse, which is quite popular in podcasting and is the most successful form of advertising, that can be more expensive. I think it's something that we don't have enormous budget to do these things. We, like everyone, we're stretched, and the current climate is difficult, and we've had to scale back on some of this stuff. And that's the reality. And I think, a lot of newsrooms, we always hear about the struggles after the fact, when jobs are being cut or, divisions are being closed. But the reality is, in real time, almost everyone I know is rethinking how they're working at the moment, because the climate is particularly difficult. And I think that's a collective reality for everyone. So we don't have huge marketing budgets at the moment. So we've scaled back on a lot of that sort of advertising in podcasts. But where we have a show that we really feel has the potential to really grow, where we think we've got a really powerful story, then we will put money behind it, and we will seek out the shows or the hosts that we think have the most likelihood to sell that show to their audiences successfully. And you are talking thousands of pounds, but where we've been able to, we've we have seen some success with that. But again, it's not the real success is going viral, and that happens once in a blue moon, and people have we have no control over that. You can't replicate that again. So Sweet Bobby went viral, and that was amazing. But again, it's a bit magic. It's hard to know when that will happen and how to control it.
Yeah, albeit a very attractive idea. Yes, I'm at a conference right now in Vienna, and the director of European TikTok was here and trying to give us the recipe for virality on his platform.
There is no recipe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There is no recipe.
Yeah, just don't talk about sensitive issues, I guess, according to him. It was a tough conversation and one without any clear answers. We have maybe a final question. Serhi has lost his voice. Sorry, Serhi. Hope you're doing well. Older users, how are you? Are you producing podcasts for that audience? He's assuming that mostly younger people, millennials, amongst your listeners, but not many 45 plus, according to statistics generally. Older people certainly listen to the radio, I think, a lot more. How have you thought about targeting older audiences?
To be honest, we haven't thought about targeting older or younger audiences. That's not been a part of our strategy. The strategy was, what journalism do we care about? What formats do we care about? How can we be the best at what we want to do? And that's the audience that we've reached. And we're still young, so I think older audiences are sort of more established in their news consumption, in that they generally consume newspapers. They're more sort of focused on legacy brands, so the Times, the New York Times, the Guardian, and so they're well served actually in terms of news. Who isn't well served is younger audiences who generally find their news in a really disparate set of sources, and are often trying to sift what's true from what's totally not true. And so I think where we've found a younger audience, we're very happy to try and build and retain that audience. And if it becomes appropriate for us to think about products for older listeners, then we will. But I can't see that being a priority at the moment. I think we're very much story first, investigation first, rather than audience first.
The editorial team is making the final decisions at Tortoise Media.
Much to everyone's annoyance.
Yeah, right. Cool. I think that's it from our end. Yeah, we've reached the hour directly. Super interesting to have you on, Basia. Really, I think everyone took a lot from the session. We'll be posting it to our group later on, but I think we can close out there. So yeah, really big thank you for joining our accelerator. There will be plenty more opportunities to discuss with people and learn from one another. So we hope to stay in touch. Hopefully see you in Vienna at the end of May.
Yeah, see you.
Most people from the group will be there, at least one member from each team. And for everyone else, have a great rest of your week. As I had messaged yesterday or the day before, the module by David Tivdren on skills for the digital era is up on the Pathright. We'll also put this session up there as well. And see you in, I think, 2 weeks for our next session. Have a great rest of your day and enjoy your long weekends, everyone.
Thanks for having me, guys. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
See you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.